The judge's son sat alone in the dimly lit library, the echo of his own sighs filling the vast room, surrounded by towering shelves of law books that seemed to mock him with every spine and title. The results of yet another failed exam lay crumpled on the desk in front of him, and he could feel the heavy weight of disappointment pressing down on his shoulders like an invisible hand. For as long as he could remember, his life had been a careful balance of expectations, rules, and comparisons, and no matter how hard he tried, nothing seemed to be enough. Every page he had read, every late night he had spent studying, every argument he had practiced aloud in empty rooms felt pointless now, as if all his effort had disappeared into thin air. The thought of facing his father, a man known for his sharp mind and even sharper words, filled him with a mixture of dread and shame that made it hard to breathe. He wondered if law was truly his path, or if he had been chasing someone else's dream, a shadow of what his family expected him to be, rather than who he really was. The quiet of the library seemed to amplify every failure, every forgotten rule, and every tiny mistake he had made over the past months, making them loom larger than life. He rubbed his temples, trying to think of a way out, any solution that could somehow undo the feelings of inadequacy gnawing at him. But the harder he tried, the more hopeless the struggle felt. Outside, the halls were empty, and the flickering lights above cast long, uncertain shadows across the floor, making the space feel both comforting and suffocating at the same time. He thought about all the students around him, classmates who seemed to grasp concepts with ease, and he couldn't help but compare himself, wondering why they seemed capable of understanding what he could not. Doubt began to creep in, whispering cruel questions into his mind. Was he not smart enough? Did he lack the talent that law required? Would he ever rise above this constant failure, or was he destined to carry the burden of disappointment for the rest of his life? Each question felt heavier than the last, pressing him further into despair. And yet, amidst the shadows and quiet, a small, restless part of him refused to give in completely. He stayed seated, staring at the papers in front of him, feeling a mix of anger, shame, and a strange flicker of determination he could not fully understand. Somewhere deep inside, he knew he had to find a way forward, but the path was unclear, tangled in fear, uncertainty, and self-doubt. The night dragged on slowly, hours stretching endlessly as he wrestled with thoughts that offered no answers, only more questions, until finally, a quiet tension settled over him, a sense that something, somehow, was about to change, though he had no idea what it could be or from where the help might come. As he stacked his books and tried to shove the weight of failure into the backpack, the young man noticed movement at the far end of the library, where the lights flickered softly over rows of empty chairs. A janitor was quietly sweeping the floor, moving with a rhythm that seemed deliberate, almost meditative. Unlike most people he had seen in the building, the janitor's presence didn't feel intrusive or judgmental. There was a calmness about him, a quiet awareness that made the young man pause and watch for a moment longer than he intended. He felt an unusual pull, a curious tug at the part of him that still wanted guidance, even though he didn't expect it to come from someone like this. The janitor didn't speak or glance at him, yet there was something in the way he moved, in the slow, thoughtful way he cleaned, that suggested he understood more than the young man could imagine. Hesitation filled the boy's throat, a mixture of awkwardness and curiosity, but finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and unsure, asking why the janitor always stayed so late, working alone in the empty library. The janitor paused, leaned lightly on his broom, and turned his eyes toward the young man, his expression calm but full of an unspoken knowledge, the kind of knowledge that only comes from having seen much of the world. Then, in a small but deliberate smile, he said something simple, almost cryptic, hinting that sometimes the greatest lessons in life came from the most unexpected places, from people who were overlooked, underestimated, or ignored. The young man frowned slightly, unsure whether he was supposed to understand immediately or wait for the meaning to reveal itself later. But the words planted a tiny seed of curiosity, a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. He watched the janitor resume sweeping, but now the ordinary act seemed charged with significance, as though every careful sweep of the broom was also a lesson in patience, focus, and quiet determination. Questions bubbled up in his mind. Why did he care so much about what this man thought? How could someone who appeared so ordinary hold wisdom that might matter to him? And yet, there was no sense of intrusion, no judgment in the janitor's presence. Only a calm assurance that perhaps the answers the young man sought weren't always found in books or lectures, but in observation, listening, and being open to guidance from places he would never have expected. As the young man slung his backpack over his shoulder and prepared to leave, he felt an invisible thread connecting him to this quiet figure, a hint that the struggles and confusion weighing him down might not have to be carried alone. That night, walking through empty halls and hearing the distant hum of the lights, he thought about the janitor's words, replaying them in his mind, and a small, cautious hope began to grow. A feeling that someone he had overlooked might just hold the key to understanding how to face his failures and move forward in ways he had never imagined. Over the next few evenings, the young man found himself returning to the library long after the classrooms had emptied, not because he had more homework, but because he wanted to hear what the janitor might say. At first, the conversations were small, almost casual. The janitor would mention a way to organize books efficiently or how to notice details others overlooked, but soon the lessons grew deeper, layered with meaning the young man hadn't expected. He spoke about focus, about how the mind could wander if not trained, and how one mistake did not define a person's entire effort. He spoke about discipline, about creating small, achievable goals and following them even when no one was watching, and about patience, the kind that allowed a person to persist through failure without losing hope. Most of all, he talked about learning from mistakes, about seeing failure not as an end, but as a guide, a map of what to do differently next time. The young man listened with rapt attention, hanging on every word, feeling a strange mix of awe and disbelief that someone who cleaned floors for a living could understand the struggles he felt better than his professors ever had. The lessons weren't abstract theories or hollow advice. They were practical strategies that could be applied to every study session, every case study, every exam he faced. Each evening he tried to put the janitor's words into action, rearranging his study habits, pacing his reading, rewriting notes in ways that made sense to him, and questioning his old assumptions about intelligence and success. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a spark began to grow inside him, replacing the heavy despair that had clung to him like a shadow. The hopelessness that had made the library feel like a cage now felt lighter, and he began to see his failures differently, not as proof that he wasn't capable, but as stepping stones he had yet to navigate properly. The janitor never pushed, never demanded. He only shared stories, small strategies, and moments of reflection that left the young man thinking long after he had left the library each night. Sometimes, the janitor would pause in his sweeping and look at him with a quiet smile, a look that seemed to say, "You're learning. You'll find your way." The suspense of not knowing exactly what would come next in these conversations made each visit compelling, almost magnetic, drawing the young man further into a world of understanding he hadn't known existed. And as the days passed, he noticed subtle changes. He remembered case laws more clearly, analyzed arguments with more precision, and faced problems he had once avoided with cautious determination. That spark of hope grew steadily, not as a sudden burst, but as a quiet flame that warmed his confidence and reshaped the way he saw himself. By the end of these evenings, the young man realized that the janitor had given him more than advice. He had given him a framework for thinking, a mindset that turned despair into curiosity and confusion into action. and for the first time in months, he felt that the impossible might just be within reach. After listening to the janitor's advice for several evenings, the young man decided it was time to put the lessons into practice. Though a small voice in his head whispered doubts about whether it would really make a difference, he began with the simplest step, breaking down complex law cases into smaller, manageable parts, as the janitor had suggested, instead of trying to memorize entire rulings or arguments at once. He separated them into key points, identified the logic behind each step, and wrote them down in his own words, making them feel personal and understandable. At first, it was slow and frustrating. His mind kept drifting to the failures of the past, and he worried that maybe he was simply wasting time. But he forced himself to pause, breathe, and approach each study session with patience rather than panic, telling himself that progress did not have to be instant. Slowly, patterns began to emerge in his notes. Connections that had previously seemed invisible now stood out clearly, and arguments that had once seemed impossible to analyze now unfolded logically, step by step. He experimented with summarizing cases in different ways, testing which method helped him remember the details best, and as he practiced, a quiet confidence began to replace the anxiety that had weighed on him for so long. Every evening, he revisited the material, not to race through it, but to deepen his understanding, asking himself questions, predicting possible exam scenarios, and then checking his reasoning against the original text. The more he applied the janitor's techniques, the more he realized that studying law wasn't about sheer memorization. It was about seeing patterns, thinking critically, and being patient with the process. Even when he stumbled or misunderstood a point, he reminded himself of the janitor's words about learning from mistakes, turning errors into guides rather than failures. His friends and classmates began to notice a change in him. He was calmer during discussions, more confident when presenting arguments, and surprisingly persistent when others gave up on tricky problems. The young man also discovered that the act of writing summaries in his own words was transformative. It allowed him to take ownership of his learning, turning abstract concepts into knowledge he could actively use. Nights that had once felt heavy with doubt now carried a sense of purpose, and even the library, with its quiet corners and towering shelves, felt less like a place of pressure and more like a space of opportunity. He caught himself smiling quietly when a difficult case finally made sense, a small but powerful acknowledgement of his growth. Slowly, each small success built on the last, creating momentum he hadn't experienced before. For the first time in months, he felt capable of handling the workload of law school, not through luck or natural talent, but because he had learned to study with intention, focus, and strategy. By the end of several weeks of applying these lessons, he no longer feared the challenges ahead. He felt prepared, grounded, and, most importantly, confident that with persistence, he could overcome obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable, and that the spark of hope the janitor had ignited was now steadily growing into a flame of real possibility. The day he received the results of his first truly difficult exam after applying the janitor's advice, the young man felt a strange mixture of disbelief and excitement as he stared at the paper in front of him. For a long moment, he could not breathe, unsure if he was seeing correctly, and then, slowly, a warm, unfamiliar surge of pride spread through him, filling the corners of his mind that had been darkened by months of passing this exam was more than just a number or a grade. It was proof that his efforts, patience, and the small practical lessons he had been following were working. He remembered the sleepless nights, the careful breakdown of cases into manageable steps, the summaries he had written in his own words, and the way he had slowed down instead of panicking when the material felt impossible, and all of it suddenly made sense. For the first time, he realized that failure was no longer a source of fear, but a stepping stone, a tool that guided him toward better understanding. The sensation was subtle but powerful, like a small seed beginning to grow after months of being buried under soil. and he felt it spreading with every heartbeat. That sense of progress gave him momentum, and with each small victory, whether it was understanding a complicated legal argument or remembering a key precedent without struggle, his confidence built quietly but steadily. He began to notice a pattern in his own growth. Success was not the result of natural talent, intelligence, or some unfair advantage. It came from persistence, perspective, and guidance, combined with the willingness to put in the work even when results were not immediate. Unlike before, he no longer compared himself to other students or imagined their effortless brilliance as a reflection of his inadequacy. Instead, he focused on his own progress, on applying what he had learned from the janitor and from his own mistakes, and the difference was like night and day. Even his classmates started to notice a change in him. He answered questions with clarity, approached complex discussions with calm reasoning, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that drew others to seek his insight. Each success, no matter how small, felt like a brick added to the foundation of his self-belief, and he began to feel that perhaps his failures had not been punishments, but lessons that had prepared him for this very moment. The pride he experienced was not loud or boastful, but steady, grounding him in the knowledge that he could overcome challenges, and that persistence could change his path in ways he had once thought impossible. By the time he left the exam room, he walked with a lighter step, carrying a sense of purpose he had not felt in months, understanding that real achievement came from steady effort, reflection, and the guidance of someone who had believed in him when he had not yet believed in himself. That first success, small but deeply meaningful, marked the beginning of a transformation, one that promised that the young man's future was no longer defined by fear, but by determination, understanding, and a quiet, unshakable hope. Even as he began to see real progress in his studies and felt the quiet satisfaction of small victories, a shadow of doubt began to creep back into the young man's mind, persistent and insistent, refusing to be ignored. Every time he prepared for an exam or presented an argument in class, he felt the invisible weight of his father's expectations pressing down on him, reminding him of the long line of achievements his family demanded. He wondered if passing exams, even with distinction, would ever be enough to earn the respect he secretly craved, or if he would always live in the shadow of his father's judgment. Nights became restless, the library's quiet corners echoing with his thoughts and questions, the weight of self-doubt making the victories he had celebrated feel fragile and temporary. One evening, exhausted and tense, he lingered after everyone had left, staring at his notes with a sense of frustration and unease, feeling the familiar sting of uncertainty. The janitor was still there, quietly sweeping as always, his presence steady and calm amid the turmoil of the young man's mind. On impulse, he spoke, confessing the fears he had kept bottled up, the anxiety that no matter how well he performed, it might never be enough. The janitor paused, leaning slightly on his broom, and in a voice gentle yet firm, reminded him that the respect and approval of others, even those closest to him, could never define his worth or his success. True achievement, the janitor explained, begins from within, from self-belief and the understanding that persistence, integrity, and dedication carry more weight than applause or recognition. Listening carefully, the young man felt the words sink in slowly, like water dripping onto dry earth, nourishing a part of him that had been parched by years of doubt and comparison. The concept was simple, but revolutionary to him. If he could trust himself, if he could believe in the value of his own effort and the lessons he had learned, then no failure, no criticism, and no external judgment could shake him. That night, as he left the library, the hallways no longer felt oppressive. The flickering light seemed to guide him rather than mock him. In the quiet air, he realized that the janitor's advice was not just about study techniques or passing exams. It was about building a foundation of confidence that no one could take away, a resilience that would sustain him long after the pressures of law school or his father's expectations faded. Though the doubt lingered faintly, it no longer controlled him. Instead, it became a reminder to return to focus, to apply his methods, and to trust in himself. Walking home under the streetlights, he felt a small but powerful shift, a sense that he had taken the first step toward mastering not only his studies but also his own fears, and that the path ahead, though still challenging, could now be faced with clarity, determination, and a new understanding of what real success truly meant. The young man stared at the thick case study in front of him, a text that had once seemed impossible to comprehend, and for a moment, a wave of doubt threatened to overwhelm him. This was the very type of challenge that had caused him to fail before, the kind of assignment that had made him question his abilities and wonder if he was truly cut out for law. But now, armed with the janitor's lessons on focus, patience, and structured thinking, he approached the problem differently. He began by carefully mapping out every argument in the case, breaking it down into its smallest parts, and writing each point clearly in his own words. Then, following the techniques he had learned, he anticipated possible objections, considered alternative interpretations, and arranged his reasoning in a logical, step-by-step flow. Each paragraph he drafted seemed to build on the last, and, for the first time, he could see the entire structure of the argument clearly, as if the fog that had clouded his mind for months had lifted. Days passed as he refined his analysis, rechecking facts, and rehearsing his presentation aloud in front of an empty chair, imagining the questions that might be asked. When the day arrived to present in class, he felt a flutter of nerves, but also a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had prepared thoroughly and intentionally. Standing before his peers and professors, he explained the case, guiding his audience through each argument with clarity, pausing to address potential counterpoints, and responding to questions with calm precision. The room was silent, attentive. Every eye focused on him, and he noticed the subtle nods of understanding from classmates who had once seemed so much more confident than him. Even his toughest professor, known for rarely giving praise, looked at him with a small, approving smile, commenting on the precision and clarity of his logic, and for a moment, the young man felt a surge of accomplishment that went far beyond a simple grade. It wasn't just that he had succeeded in presenting the case, it was that he had applied the janitor's wisdom, transformed his approach, and proven to himself that he could overcome challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. The feeling of triumph was intoxicating, but also grounding. He realized that success was not magic or luck, but the careful application of knowledge, structure, and persistence. Walking back from class, he felt lighter, the heavy weight of past failures beginning to lift, replaced by a sense of control and clarity. He understood now that each obstacle was an opportunity, each difficult assignment a chance to grow, and each small step forward, guided by the lessons he had received, was part of a larger transformation. That turning point marked the moment when he truly began to believe in himself, when the spark of hope he had nurtured over countless evenings in the library became a steady flame, illuminating the path ahead and showing him that, with focus, preparation, and courage, even the most formidable challenges could be met and mastered. In the weeks following his breakthrough, the young man began to notice subtle but significant changes around him. Word of his improvement had quietly spread through the halls of the law school, and professors who had once seemed indifferent or critical now observed him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They noticed the dedication in his work, the meticulous care with which he approached each case study, and the thoughtful way he responded during discussions. It wasn't long before fellow students started to seek him out, asking for his insights on assignments they found challenging, quietly admitting that they were impressed by his methodical approach and calm confidence. At first he was hesitant to share, feeling that his own struggles might make him seem unqualified to advise others. But he soon realized that the very techniques that had helped him succeed could also help those around him. The more he shared, the more he understood that the lessons he had learned from the janitor were far bigger than passing exams. They were lessons about personal growth, resilience in the face of difficulty, and the quiet development of leadership. He began to see that success was not merely a matter of memorizing facts or earning grades, but about cultivating patience, understanding, and the ability to guide oneself and, in turn, others. With each conversation he had, his gratitude toward the janitor grew stronger. He reflected on those evenings in the library, watching the janitor sweep the floor and share small but powerful insights. And he realized that guidance often comes from the most unexpected sources. The janitor's calm, patient presence had given him tools not only to succeed academically, but also to approach life with confidence and perspective. This realization made him view the world differently. He began to notice the overlooked figures around him, the quiet people whose experience and wisdom often went unnoticed. There was a sense of humility in understanding that the janitor's impact was profound, yet unassuming, and that true guidance does not require fame, wealth, or status. The young man also noticed a shift within himself. He felt more capable of handling challenges, more willing to take initiative, and more aware that leadership meant helping others find their way, not just advancing one's own goals. Each acknowledgement, from professors or classmates, each question seeking his advice, reinforced his belief that the lessons he had absorbed were not temporary fixes, but lifelong principles that could shape his character and career. In quiet moments, when he thought about his past struggles and the fear that had once held him back, he felt a deep sense of appreciation for the journey, for the failures that had led him to seek guidance, and for the janitor who had shown him that wisdom could appear in any form, from anyone, at any moment. Recognition was no longer just external. It was internal, a self-awareness that he had grown, learned, and begun to step confidently into his own potential, ready to face challenges with clarity, patience, and a renewed belief in what he could achieve. The day of the most important exam of his law program arrived, with a mixture of excitement and a familiar, creeping fear that made his stomach twist and his palms sweat. This was the moment he had dreaded for months, the test that could define whether all his hard work, all the nights spent studying and applying the janitor's lessons, would finally pay off. As he sat in the quiet examination hall, lined with focused faces and the scratch of pens on paper, he felt the old panic threatening to return, whispering doubts into his mind, reminding him of past failures and the heavy expectations of his family. But this time, the fear was different. It was no longer paralyzing. He took a deep breath and reminded himself of every strategy the janitor had taught him, breaking problems into manageable parts, approaching questions with patience, and trusting in the preparation and understanding he had carefully built. As the exam began, he tackled each section methodically, pausing to think through complex arguments, anticipating possible counterpoints, and writing his answers with clarity and confidence he had never experienced before. Every page he completed reinforced the quiet conviction that he was ready, that he could handle this challenge with the same focus and discipline he had practiced in every study session. Time seemed to stretch and contract, each minute filled with intense concentration. Yet he noticed that the panic which had once clouded his mind no longer controlled him. He worked steadily, relying on logic, reflection, and the lessons he had internalized, transforming nervous energy into precision and thoughtfulness. When he finally placed his pen down and leaned back, there was a calm satisfaction in knowing that he had done everything in his power to succeed, and that this time, the outcome would not be left to chance or natural talent. It would reflect the effort, discipline, and persistence he had cultivated over months. Weeks later, when the results were announced, a wave of relief and triumph washed over him. Not only had he passed, but he had excelled, earning marks that reflected his true understanding and hard work. The years of doubt, the moments of despair, the fear of failure, All seemed to lift from his shoulders in an instant, replaced by a profound sense of accomplishment and self-belief. Walking through the hallways afterward, he felt lighter, freer, as if the weight of expectation and past mistakes had finally been set down. In that moment, he understood that this success was about far more than grades. It was about growth, resilience, and the ability to confront fear with patience and strategy. He thought about the janitor, whose quiet guidance and simple lessons had reshaped his approach to learning and life, and he felt deep gratitude for the unexpected mentor who had helped him discover his own potential. The exam was no longer just a test of knowledge. It had become proof of what dedication, persistence, and belief in oneself could achieve. A milestone that marked the beginning of a future where doubt would no longer dictate his path, and where he could face every challenge with confidence, clarity, and a quiet, unshakable courage. The day of graduation arrived, bright and warm, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the auditorium and the quiet murmur of proud families and excited students filling the space. The young man sat among his peers, dressed in his gown, feeling a mixture of accomplishment and reflection, thinking back on the long, difficult journey that had brought him here. He remembered every failure, every sleepless night, every moment of self-doubt, and he realized that each of those challenges had been essential in shaping the person he had become. As the ceremony progressed, and names were called one by one, he felt a growing anticipation for the moment when he would step forward, not only to receive his diploma, but also to honor the person who had quietly transformed his life. When his name was finally announced, he walked to the stage with steady steps, each one carrying the weight of years of struggle, but also the strength of hard-earned confidence. Looking out at the audience, he spotted the janitor among the crowd, who had never sought recognition but had quietly guided him through countless evenings in the library, offering patience, wisdom, and encouragement when he had needed it most. Taking a deep breath, he paused before the microphone and spoke, his voice steady yet full of emotion, publicly thanking the janitor for being the mentor he had never expected. The person whose quiet presence and insight had changed the trajectory of his life. He spoke of the lessons that went far beyond textbooks or exam techniques, the importance of patience, the value of learning from mistakes, the power of trust in oneself, and the humility to accept guidance when it came from unexpected places. As he spoke, his peers listened intently, some nodding in understanding, others reflecting on the mentors who had shaped their own paths, and a few even realizing that wisdom and encouragement could come from the most overlooked corners of their daily lives. The young man acknowledged that true success was not the avoidance of failure, but the ability to face challenges with courage, to persist through difficulties, and to remain open to learning, guidance, and growth at every step. The janitor, standing quietly, allowed a small knowing smile to cross his face, and in that smile, the young man saw the culmination of months of effort, patience, and trust in human potential. He understood now that the janitor's secret was not a set of study tips or clever tricks. It was the power of encouragement, the reminder that belief in another person's ability could ignite change, and the patience to allow growth to happen gradually and consistently. As the ceremony concluded, and applause filled the auditorium, the young man felt a profound sense of gratitude and purpose, knowing that the lessons he had learned would guide him far beyond the walls of law school, shaping not only his career, but the way he approached life, challenges, and the people around him. Walking off the stage, diploma in hand, he carried with him a quiet but enduring legacy, the knowledge that guidance, belief, and patience could transform failure into achievement, doubt into confidence, and ordinary moments into life-changing lessons that would remain with him forever.